I wanted to sort of now start this conversation with you guys and talk a bit about, we set as sort of theme these aspects about the plot and the character. But, this is an acting festival, right? So I'd like to sort of start this conversation with you focusing more on the problems of reading. Because one of the things that Øystein and I immediately reacted and that we thought was interesting when we read your book was also that we also experienced that it's not just about writing in a different way. There is a real problem of reading also classic text and plays, and this has a lot of consequences in the way actors get trained and then work with text on stage. So could we say that I could read a classic text in a polyvocal way, and that would make a so-called Aristotelic text as a polyvocal text, or formulated in a different way, can I look for polyvocality in a classical text? And what consequences does this have for actors, the way they work, and directors, the way they produce their productions? Could we start this conversation thinking about this aspect?
I mean, Charles Mee takes classical texts and divises them into polyvocal texts in which actors are encouraged to enter into the dialogue with the text in any way they like. I mean, a lot of the aspects of classical texts deal with language and the vividness of language and description and so forth, and making the visual palpable for the audience to understand. So this is very similar in a way to what the language playwrights are doing, I think. I also think this idea of performativity in character, that as an acting festival, rather than thinking of interiority, we're thinking of virtuosity. In other words, the interiority that we think of in terms of realism, in which we look at actors as going inside and becoming internal and dealing with the subtext and so on. The classical text, as well as the language playwriting text, encourages the actor to get out of that shell and to work with the mobilism, and I think you talked about the vocality, for example, but to embrace a number of performative styles, what I call the performative actor, and the performative text. So these texts are really basically meant not to be read, but to be performed, to be in the moment, yes.
Because we could argue, I mean, if you take, like, let's say Chekhov, right? She's a complex writer.
Right.
We could argue that there is a very high level of polyvocality in Chekhov's writing. I mean, he's in dialogue with several forms of narration, like, you have structure from melodrama, from vaudeville, you have Gothic tale, and then you have, different kinds of language. You have philosophical discussion with the ideas of the time. You have discussions with, like, if you take more, like Chekhov, the Seagull, right? You also have discussion with some symbolistic writing and the debate about what playwriting is. I feel sometimes we have a tendency to sort of reduce the possibilities because we read plays in a way which sort of limited what we find in the plays.
This is it. I mean, I directed Hedda Gabler. I may have mentioned this. And I always thought, Ibsen was kind of stiff, realistic, uptight. It's not that way at all. As a matter of fact, I mean, you take Lovborg, the character. I thought he's a romantic character, and he's coming from that romantic tradition. So his way of speaking is different, from Braque, who's coming from a more melodramatic, kind of villain-like approach. And so you have this really, at the turn of the century, you have this kind of conflation of different styles or collision of styles. It's not simply all of a sudden we had realism and it sets itself in a blanket way. But this also adds to the performance style, so that when you're bringing out, in Hedda, for example, to bring out that kind of romantic flourish, to bring out the idea of the suicide as a kind of romantic gesture, that's relating to things in the society, the 9 Commandments of Bohemianism, Jaeger's thesis about, to take one's life was kind of a noble, heroic act and so forth. But in the actual performance of it, the actor then moves in that type of direction, and that's what gives the piece a kind of resonance and a tension between these various really dramaturgies that are kind of, in a sense, colliding with each other.
What do you think, Tala, when you hear
No,
this?
I think that any reading comes from a context again, and that we read with our glasses on, right? And this is not just a problem for the classics. I mean, it's also the problem of how we read these new playwrights with these new playwriting strategies. And that's why they're often, if you don't have a inclination or an interest for the polyvocal, you will try to unify that, and you'll try to create whole characters, and you'll try to or try to put it in a very so-called post-traumatic aesthetics, and then the text won't work because they're not based on unifying, they're based on juxtaposition and playfulness and more carnivalesque kind of models of reading. So of course the way we read also develops our concepts. So I think, and that again develops our teaching strategies for our actors, right? That's how you start the book really, Paul, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's some things that are going on in the new writing that are very interesting. One is this idea of landscape and the creating space that the actor, we as actors, you probably are, brought along as you brought it, like, you got to take space. How much space can the actor take on the stage, to command a presence and so forth? And that's a very, you're small. You say to the actor, the actor's too small. They're somehow not captured. Now, in a lot of the language playwriting, it's the idea of expansion, so that the actor is expanding the language, kind of blowing up and creating a visual sense, I think, for the audience, in which the audience can participate, and it can be faraway universes, or it can be the American landscape, the kind of go west young man kind of thing, which is something, this idea of these journey plays, in which you're trying to create a phenomenon in terms of what the text is trying to do.
I think it'd be wonderful, for instance, if someone today did Ibsen's Brann as a polyvocal landscape play.
And what would that be?
That would definitely be, first of all, it would be temporary because we are dealing with religion again, right?
Yeah, well,
And we're dealing with religion in a landscape that's saturated with religion. So this landscape that Ibsen makes Brann go through is symbolic, it's politicized, and it's religious, and it was also just landscape. And to get these different sides, or dramaturgies, you call them, of the landscape present with these characters, trying to debate an unanswerable question. It would be, and I think it could be actually both humorous and dangerous. So, but maybe it's a dangerous text, so maybe that's why. Why don't they produce Brann, do you think? Why does no one touch it?
It's maybe too episodic, I don't know, it's difficult to say. I think when you're going to do Ibsen, you're going to do Doll's House, you're going to do Hedda Gabler, you're going to do something that's sort of contained and people know about and so forth. I think that's kind of,
Yeah.
I think it comes down to a producing.
But if you read it in a polyvocal way, then the episodic side of it would be a strong point, not a weakness or a difficulty, right?
Right. I mean, I think those plays actually were more influential on the new writing than the more realistic plays.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But because you mentioned before cause and effect, we can also think about one of the biggest consequences of naturalism is the way of reading and analyzing reality as sort of governed by cause and effect. So the research for the causes that creates the effects. This has a lot of consequences also in acting, because acting is also sort of, it's the questions the actors ask themselves to sort of perform, to create behavior, right? So when you read a play, and I see this as a sort of, sometimes as a conflict also with new playwrights that we also have here at the Academy when they produce text, or when we have sort of a dramatic festival, or, when we sort of produce new plays, the need of the actor to create behavior to go and answer to this cause and effect question. So don't you think that if we don't change and we update the way we sort of, the questions actors ask themselves, the way they create, and the way they access their creativity, that we can also transform in monologic, polyvocal plays? I don't know. Don't you see this as a risk? That is
I mean, To me, it's a moment to moment. The actor plays moment to moment. If you play cause and effect, you play the result. If you're playing the result, you're already at the landing strip. So, an audience might know where a play is going, for example, at Hamlet or something. But if the actor's already getting there, or if the actor's projecting what the result will be, you're going to have a static performance. So I think in terms of doing the language playwrights, or some of the writers I talk about in this book, is a question of staying in the moment. But also think, as opposed to causality, we deal a lot with juxtaposition, and how one scene meshes with another. What's the interface between these scenes? What are the what's the frisson? Or how is that activating the text? And can it release energy in the text in different ways? Because in a causal scheme, it's very difficult to release energy because you're building towards a climactic moment.
Yeah, to the end. Yeah.
So, as a matter of fact, a lot of the time, you have to be conscious of these dramaturgies. Like even if you go back to Restoration or so forth, you'll find that a lot of the dramaturgy is just kind of almost in stasis until it hits a high point. And that's why part of the new writing with the juxtapositions creates these free zones right on, so that the text is activated at the beginning. And it's not giving you any sense of the play knows where it's going.
Yeah, and I think also, like you point out in your book, that due to that and due to those abilities that an actor has to have to be in that moment, not to create that backstory, right? I remember a very particular and wonderful experience seeing The Name by Jon Fosse, a guest performance from Schaubühne. I think it was an Ostermeyer performance. And it was wonderful. It was like human beings taken to extent. I mean, some of the characters had behavior like my grandmother. You never see it on stage because it's just too much. And then afterwards we had a discussion and people asked about the backstory. So what does this actor do? And the director looked at them and said, I don't know. And what do you think? And asked the actors, I haven't thought about it. Does he go to the office? I don't care.
Yes.
You are in the situation. And that's what you're saying. And also it involved a lot of very, very minute, Fosse-like, almost flat, non-character-based areas, but also very, very strong physical elements. I remember there was a scene with this woman who was a bit like my grandmother. She had bad knees and she dropped her pen and she was just trying to pick up this pen. And she was alone in her room and she couldn't get down. And finally she got down and she couldn't get up again. And it took forever. And it was wonderful. And like what you're saying in your book is that actually this way of writing changes the way we have to teach the actors to be able to perform, not from an inward-looking cause and effect point of view, we're looking for the end result, having a backstory. Can you say something about that, how that's changed in America?
Well, I mean, anyway, millennial students are different than, my generation, right? I mean, people are more open to, what's happening, and you see it, in these YouTube parodies and memes and things. And I mean, people are basically taking performative styles on and putting it out there on YouTube and presenting themselves in a number of different contexts, of which, your generation is much hipper to than mine would be. Now, my sons will show me this stuff, but they're doing, it's a lot of parody, a lot of memes, things brought in with Twitter feeds and so on, and creating these kind of texts and performance styles that are organic and maybe to an extent not trained. Some of the actors are trained. But the sense is that the actor, when I work with new texts, like when I directed Margot Vale or I directed some of the stuff that's in the book here, I find that actors are really wanting to go for this kind of stuff. Like if you have a magician, well, then the actor has to learn, kind of the magic tricks and how to sell a trick. So there's shtick there. It's kind of, in a way, it's coming back from those old school, from vaudeville and these older forms. The carnivalesque, the master of ceremony, how to present that kind of character on stage. These are, theatrical tropes almost. So the actor, it's fantastic for the actor because the actor wants to be introduced to as many of these these tropes or performance modes, archetypal modes, and a lot of we talk about in character is based on archetypes. And so if you take an archetype and then you add to it your own eccentricities as an actor, or your twitches, or your takes, then it becomes very virtuosic, it becomes very personal, and it becomes growth. I think it becomes growth for the actor versus, say, working within a strict idiom of realism, for example. Like, for example, like one would do in television, for example, in a dramatic format.
This makes me, sorry,
No,
did you
you
want to
go
add
on.
something?
No, I'm just thinking that, so it's interesting because what we do when we teach playwriting, Paul, is try to find ways of developing techniques for that, for producing that kind of text and that kind of composition, right?
Right.
That kind of tension and friction and so on, it's juxtaposition. And I guess in a way, when you're going to teach actors, you have to develop these tools that you have been developing and I'm trying to develop myself. So I guess, Gianluca, that's probably that you're saying that this is a job that has to be done now, is to develop these tools. I don't know, but maybe they're still here.
It's in development, and what I think was one of the things that when I read your book that I found very interesting, that you introduce in a very clear way a lot of terminology that can be sort of used in other fields. So immediately I thought about the polyvocal actor. What is the polyvocal actor? Is an actor that is coming out from the revolution of performance art and what's happened in the last 50 years with theater and post-dramatic theater, and is an actor that sort of has a complex access to all the possibilities of creation that this actor has in any given time. So that instead of reducing the source of creation to a very specific methodology, which makes the actor monologic, it's open to sort of it's open to the creation that comes from different sources. And I think this is actually in a very invisible way. It's what we've been trying to talk about the last 20 years also in acting, that we felt that to see an actor creating from one perspective was not enough anymore, because the audience was changing. They wanted something else. They wanted another kind of theatrical approach. So I think polyvocality was an interesting word to describe an actor which is really accessing a more complex way of creation, which comes from very different voices inside herself.
Yeah, that's great. You know, it also exposes this concept, I think is very important, this concept of interruption, that if the actor can stop and then move into another performance style, the audience immediately is shaken from its torpor, because audiences generally just kind of slump down, you know how it is. We talked, I think we talked about it yesterday a little bit, about this New York Times article about how many people fall asleep, and actors who go there, to Broadway shows and seeing, 30% of the audience taking a snooze, So it's very disconcerting. The principle of interruption may be a survival mechanism for us, because ultimately we shake the audience from its torpor. And let's face it, the rooms are dark like it is, and it's comfortable and cozy. Then you hear kind of in a monologic play, a kind of a drone. There's a little bit of a drone that goes on like that, right? And if the staging is static, then the same thing happens. So the staging has to be dynamic, okay? So you have dynamic staging, you have the principle of juxtaposition. So we're in these, so here we are in this world. So the audience is forced into an engagement, into a dialogism in a way with what's happening in the spectacle, but also the director is forced to, okay, we've got to make this switch. We've got to make this polyvocal switch here. So we need this different type of performance approach for this particular scene. We need this particular type of engagement. And I think that's maybe key, really, to getting more audiences involved and getting, millennial audiences. It's a new idea, of bringing people into the theater so that they rather come to the theater than, for example, see something on TV or hang out with the internet and that sort of thing.
You also have this small chapter about the equivocal character. Or the
equivocal,
yeah. How do you pronounce it?
Equivocal.
Equivocal.
Yeah, we did an exercise.
Yeah.
How you guys, we had some fun with that yesterday.
I think that's really interesting because it's actually not a stable character. It's
Yes.
and
Well,
also the idea of transformation, which I think is.
Well, the equivocal character is a character that takes on more than one personage. So the character is split between two characters, or maybe even three. One gentleman in our seminar, I think back had three, very interesting concept of actually going between three personages. So the actor now, that's really great, because think about the actor. The actor's got to switch gears to another character while maintaining the residue of the former character. So you're never quite in and out of it. So you're working in this in-betweenness, this liminality of character, if you will.
Which also does something with time, right? Because then you can bend time as well.
It can
can't
bend
you?
time and go back in time.
Yeah.
But it's happening in the present. We're not going into a flashback. The actor is actually making the move, So, and that's interesting, this idea of matrixing. The thing about the matrix actor in something every actor should think about is when you're developing a character and going into a high level of interiority, you're creating a matrix, and the more the subtext, the deeper the matrix. But by splitting the character in these different performance styles and so forth, you're avoiding I think that pitfall and allowing the matrix to be broken. So that you're working with different forms across a piece, and in between that, we're seeing the actor's work. So the actor's work is visible in this transformation of character.
Yes, so there's no trying to hide the actor's work behind a kind of illusion of realism or other types of illusionary strategies.
Right. So
it's there open
it's
in,
challenging,
yeah.
It's really challenging stuff.
Well, I mean,
The good fun.
it's also about sort of development of the audience, right? I mean, the audience is changing and is becoming polyvocal. The audience is more and more open for theatricality. They demand theatricality because there's a big need for that. And but also they have the possibility to at any given time, and when they go to the theater, to observe both the creation, the creator, and the private person, which is then in the job as creator. Don't you think that this sort of this demand of the audience to sort of be aware from the actor that I can, as the audience, see the way you make your art on stage. I can see you as a private person now in this room. I can decide to focus on what you're creating. That this is per se polyvocal and is sort of demanding from the actor another kind of awareness about her creation on stage. What do you think, guys, about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's. So you're saying, essentially saying the audience awareness is switching gears along with with the performance style. Yeah, I think that's important. Now, I'll tell you though, audiences are going to get pissed off from time to time, and the reason is because they're going to say, well, wait a minute. Many actors, as you know, probably you've been in a situation, well, my character would never do that. My character is, well, the audience has the same thing. That character would never do something like that. Why is that actor doing it? So it does call into question, in a sense, their ethics, what we were talking about earlier. It calls how they are approaching the production itself. And so, it reshapes the audience. The audience has to kind of go with it. The audience has to kind of become engaged in a different way than in a traditional play.
Because this was I think the big revolution about post-dramatic theater, which was really problematic, was not about, of course, the way theater was produced and the where you would get the material and the hierarchy. This is sort of inner theater discourse. But there was a revolution that came from the audience. I mean, the audience started to sort of access other form for performance, for theater, and then when they would go to see a classical play in a so-called institutional theater, dramatic theater, then they would sort of get pissed, as you say, because they would not see the qualities that they would sort of appreciate in other form of more experimental theater, and then they would demand these qualities to be within this classical work. So
it's interesting because I first got involved. I was working as a designer with Jerry Rojo when I was an undergraduate. And Rojo was Richard Schechner's designer, so I went to New York, where Dionysus in '69 was a major breakthrough play. Yeah. This is back in the '70s, early '70s. But at any rate, it was an ensemble, and people came to that show, and this was based loosely on the Bacchae, right? But it was a company in which the training was all indigenous to the company and through this ensemble group. But this was the time of the hippie movement, the communes, and so forth. But at any rate, audiences began to go to that performance, which was was called environmental theater because audiences were all around the action and the actors moved in and out and so forth. But the point here is that the audience began to see this as a religion, a new religion. I mean, they could participate. They could. There was nudity. They could get up and take off their clothes and get into it and really.
We had Scheckner here 3 years ago,
Scheckner.
and he showed also some of the videos. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, but then the women rebelled, of course. I mean, the women rebelled because the guys were coming in, just to fondle the women and so forth, and there was uprisings and so forth. But when that closed, audiences were very, very upset because they were coming to that like as a religion. They thought it wasn't just a theater event. It was very much post-dramatic in that sense. And the text was a pretext. They blew up the text. There was a lot of sense that they were relating it to phenomena that were happening in the current society as well. So.
Because I think it's, I just think it's, I just wanted to sort of pick your brains a bit, and probably also the audience later, because, I mean, this idea of shifting attention and like waking up the audience, as you call it, or like involving the audience in some way or another, making people aware that it is a performance. I mean, that's not only to do with the post-traumatic theater, it's also very Brechtian, right?
Yes.
But what and I'm just thinking, I don't know this, but I'm thinking about it, but maybe the difference between the Brechtian attitude or even the most post-dramatic, like performance-based, interaction-based techniques is that they want to do something with the audience. But I have a feeling in this new playwriting strategy, they're doing something with the audience. The audience are rather inside the composition.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, like, the difference is Brecht is dialectic and this is dialogic. And I think the difference is one is an argument that has to deal with the social sphere and has to deal with a corrective, a societal corrective. Whereas the dialogic is entering into a dialogue interaction about an ontology, that is a state of being that may not have an ideology, a specific ideology that's being purported.
And also a bigger trust, I think, in the audience. Not so much thinking I have to do something for the audience, but believing that the audience already are doing something and that we're doing something together. That's sort of ingrained in the attitude of both the reading of the material and the writing, if you were polyvocality.
Yes, I would think so. If you look at, in terms of some of the post-dramatic stuff, like Punch Drunk did this show last year. It was, when I was in 2014, it was in the UK, but the National Theatre, right, which does Shakespeare in a very traditional form, they were doing Eight Bore and so on. At the same time, they're producing Punch Drunk in a warehouse, which is where all the audience has to wear a mask and go in through multiple levels and seeing these various scenarios. So every audience
total immersive theater.
Yeah, it's totally immersive, and audiences are seeing different parts of different plays, different performance style. But also they did a survey, and the audience many had never gone to the theater before. So this kind of theatrical event that was allowed flexibility, allowed audience members to move about and create basically their own show, was a totally new phenomenon. But it's developing a new audience for theater.
There are sort of, at the end of the day, theater makers, they meet in a room and they have to take some decisions. You can't get out of that. And there are, I see in students, both directors and actors, there is the fear and there is the expectation. Actors have the expectation that directors know the answers, or you have to take decisions that in a way sort of make sense to each other. I find all these sort of problems still very present. We have sort of, we produce very post-dramatic or polyvocal art, we write, we also perform and we do things, but we still have some obstacles when we have to sort of teach or when we have to sort of get together and trust the fact that we don't have to agree on the outcome. We don't have to agree on why we take these decisions. That that this freedom is scary in a pedagogical context.
It's a kind of consensus culture with a hierarchy in a way.
Yes, I mean there are some mechanics in the pedagogical aspect of teaching theater that try to reproduce themselves. We also have a hard time to give away some techniques, to give away some words, So how was your experience? I mean, about these things. Do you meet these as obstacles, or you always work with actors that you're like, oh, they're great. They understand my text. They perform exactly the text the way I
Yes,
thought.
always,
They never ask questions
always.
that I think are irritating, or it's
Never
just-
irritating.
Well, I think you know, it's one thing is in the in the workshop or the classroom. The other thing is over like in a rehearsal process.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have 5 weeks or so rehearsal, there's a development and a trust, but an engagement with the material that's transformative. Whereas in a one-off or in a closed session, that you're not, it's hard to replicate that. It's that sense of duration that creates a real sense of an ontology or a sense of an art, a palpable art, and that people can invest in and say, well, yes, this is what we have done. I get it. You know, I'm into it. It's happening, and it's people are responding to it. That's difficult in a situation where it's perhaps an exercise of working on a separate basis or a non-continuum. I think so. I think rehearsal is where a lot of this gets proven to the younger actor or the actor in training that something is happening, something's coming out of it.
I think actually in play development, which I do a lot of that, there's two factors that really demasks this, how we look at a good actor for this kind of work. Yes. One is the choosing. Who do we invite, right? Who do I call or write an email and say, do you want to be on this workshop? Then of course I want a flexible actor that can work fast, because we don't have that possibility to create a continuum. Maybe we just have a week or a weekend, if we're lucky, 10 days, you know. So you have to have someone who's flexible, eager, interested, and want to work fast, and who has the tools to do so.
And what are the tools?
Well, for instance, the tools are just what Paul was describing, to be able to go from the text and in. Sometimes it can take a lot of time about talking, reading, working through to find that sort of core of the character within the actor, and then go from that and out. We don't really have the time, and it doesn't necessarily get us anywhere. And often that makes the conversation, it sort of splits it, it makes it fragmented, because everybody starts doing their own work. Everybody's working with their character, with their situations. And what we need very quickly is to make a continuum of these juxtapositions, to understand how the mechanisms work. Often this is a confusing process to begin with. I often find like that the 3 first days can be quite hard, and a lot of people, the actors will say, I don't understand it, it's not a good text, I can't do it. And all of a sudden we like jump into the universe, we get it, and then we can even start to produce text together. And the actors then will say, I think my character is doing this, and this scene, I think this and this, which is wonderful. And I think then we should have, this is my real big issue, I think then we should have 2 more weeks to actually work with this.
Well, part of this too is that, you know, I mean, I speak a lot of the texts that are discussed in the book, but that the writer essentially tells the actor how to breathe. The writer is basically, if you examine the text, the writing is very, very precise and clarified. It's not long sentences. There's not a lot of extra verbiage and so on. It's very clear. It allows for specificity. It allows for operative words within a monologue that are key markers. That's what I use the term markers, because there are markers in the text that are signposts for the actor. So the actor, once the actor becomes aware of these signposts, it becomes much more digestible and easy maybe, but replicate to give the sense of what the writer's after.
And when you get to that point, then they can start being naughty, right? And rebel and do different other things, yeah, and really spice up the situation with their own material and start being creative. And that's why another thing you want an actor who has these abilities I talked about before, but also somebody who's not polite. You don't want it to be submissive, because then there's not the process. You have to have kind of energy and resistance and conversations and abilities to read. The second thing, I think, and I don't know how that is for you, is that immediately when you have invited these people into the room and they've said yes, and you start to work, you can immediately feel what kind of education they've had. And that's how you discover it too. Whether it's a Lecoq education, or it's a performance-based education, whether it's an English education, Bruce Ford, for instance, or if it's more like an old-style Stanislavski education. It immediately comes on the board, and you cannot ignore it. Sooner or later, you have to talk about it, which I think is good.
Well, I mean, if I know an actor can dance, if I know an actor can do something, I'll put it in the show. I mean, I'll work it in. You know. I mean,
agree.
whatever an actor brings a talent. I've had actors that we did one show. An actor could do these flips on stage, and it worked out that the character could do it. So this guy's doing backflips on stage. The audience went nuts, but it was perfectly within context of the show. But it's trying to dig out, you know, what actors bring to the stage.
Yeah, but this is a way of relating to actors like ready-mades, right? You have actors that have the competence. You understand that these actors has these qualities, then I put it there, so it's going to work.
What I'm saying is that these texts, many of these texts allow for that kind of performativity.
Of course, yes. But you also see shows that you go to the theater, you see a show, and it's clearly very interesting. Directing, aesthetic world they created, the universe. You try to sort of create these frictions or contrapositions, right? But then you see the actor within the contraposition trying to make sense of her journey, or try to justify the choices she make from a very sort of cause and effect, or from a very Aristotelian point of view, or from Stanislavski based. So you see, okay, the aesthetic of the world is creating this, and it also work, but I see the way this actor is working, justifying the decision she's making from a very classical approach, and I think this sometimes makes also this aesthetic world more predictable, because or easier to predict, because I think on a subconscious way we sort of decode very quickly the way the actor justify the way of being theatrical on stage, and if the actor is not able to be polyvocal, to listen to different voices of creation and surprise herself in the moment by doing stuff that don't make sense with each other, then we sort of, even if the aesthetic and the play and the show is polyvocal, it will become easier to predict. It will become a sort of monologic way of working.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, you're working with students and graduate students who are experimenting, you know, who are trying to. And that's exciting. That's fun, you know. Or if you're working a workshop, you're working with people who want to do it. For example, in America, we have community theaters, or if you go in with a resident company and they have a way of working, then you bring this in and they're not receptive to it, or say, well, you know, standoffish. It may be difficult, just as it is in Hollywood. You know, if you bring a star in, then the star says no. I mean, you know, and the director. So I mean, there are. It's the body, how innovative does your corpus want to be, and you know how predictable do they want to be, you know, and what's their comfort zone. So at this point in the training is the time to stretch out the comfort zone, to allow for as much, and also to build professional resumes or whatever, but to build a broad panoply of skills. However, it settles down, and I think you're right. I mean, you might have limitations as it goes forward. So a director may have more opportunities working with a cohort of students, graduate students, or young professionals than with a more staid or stable company, I would think.
But it's quite interesting, Gianluca, because I follow your thought a long way, but I also know about very experimental writers who really prefer to work with Stanislavski-educated actors. Personally, for me, that sometimes can be very time-consuming and breaks off the communication between the actors as well, and the actors and the text. Not always, but sometimes. It depends on how they utilize their craft, right? But actually, some of the very experimental writers I know of really enjoy that resistance.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But what I'm talking about, this is sort of creating awareness, which I think why also the book was interesting, an awareness of the way we relate to the sort of tools that we develop. I mean, when you learn a tool, there is the tool and there's the ideology that comes with the tool. And there's the way you sort of talk about the tool, right? I think it's the problem is very much there. It's not I'm a fan of the Stanislavski way of working, or a lot of the tools and the ideas that comes from there, but I have a problematic with sometimes with the rhetorics and the way we relate to that,
Yeah.
because sometimes they can create an actor which is afraid of stretching outside of the tool or playing with the tool. So it makes the tool a limitation
Yes.
and not a starting point or a foundation. And I think it's very important every 10 years to sort of constantly renew the way we relate and talk about these tools, while also other tools come on the way.
Well, I think, you can articulate what you want in a progressive text in the language the actor understands, and get at the same result. It's up to the director to basically articulate, to be able to find the common ground where the actor can make sense out of what's being said, and also getting what's being anticipated in the text, or what the text is kind of projecting in terms of a performance style.
But at the core of this, again, if we return to the beginning, Jean-Luc, is the reading. So the first is the reading. How do we read this? How do we understand it? And if we have a polyvocal reading, how do we talk about it? And that's why I think, in a way, these new playwriting strategies are a gift, because we have to start talking about how we are educating our actors and how they feel about their work. It's forcing us to do that. And I think that's the biggest gift we can have, because then we can actually start not just understanding it the way that it is vocabulary, it is training, it's not this is theater, or this is acting, or this is the way it is. It's not given. It happens in a context, in a tradition, right? And also then try to do what Paul's doing, develop new terminology that we can actually talk about it as a common ground between us.
Could we say, just to conclude and then open to the audience, that we move from a sort of actor, the time of the actor and the the interpretation of the actor, to the time of the actor in dialogue, the dialogistic actor. So an actor moves from seeing her purpose as creating an interpretation of material to an actor that sees her purpose in giving the possibility of material to be in dialogue in the room with something else. Could that be a possibility? Do you see this as a landscape? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what it is. I think that's what I talk about, dialogic monologue, that the monologue is creating a dialogue with the audience, but also with the space, which is the room. Yeah, so it is expanding. It is creating a sense of out there versus in here.
Yeah, it's a continuous feedback loop between who you are as a person, the actor, the things you are working with within the character, the space you're in, the other characters, and the audience, and back again.
One other thing.
It's complete.
I agree with. I think that this idea of that the narrator or the monologue is often connecting to the rest of the text. That the actor is almost serving the function of the writer in the moment on stage. In other words, directing the actions that are happening, or anticipating, calling into question where we're going, what the next move. Another narrator may come into it and redirect the play, so that the narrator is serving the function of the playwright in many ways, or the director in terms of shaping the narrative.
So, and again, it's a kind of positioning of a present, being in the present, and constantly pushing the present to be important for everybody, everything around you, and that everything around is important for you. It's nice.
Yeah, I mean, the actor that works with interpretation creates ownership, then perform to create an impact, to create something, to impact on the space and the audience. But there's the way of also getting the material and sort of being a vehicle, sort of something that makes this material present in the room, so that we can see what is this for us, what does this do to us while we share, like we're doing now. I mean, we have shared this form. We talk like this. We get to know each other in a different way, in different contexts, in different roles. So, what is this? What does this do to us? It's a way of relating to the moment, to the material, which can be dialogistic or polyvocal or open to sort of, well, let's see what happens. And Don't you agree? I don't know.
Yeah, well, trying to see where all of this, where it's going now, what's projecting into the future as we're moving forward, and, what the role of theater is and what the role of polyvocal theater is. And I think it's very important, I think the idea of collective playwriting is very important because I think, for example, it's a way for groups to get together and write collectively, but like for students to write, to create something. It's difficult for a student to create an entire play initially, but by working 5 students together, you can create a play. I mean, everybody gets a part, and you have the sense of creating a wholeness and a collaboration. And it's also this idea of globalization. Right now, we have a situation in the world which I think is very, very serious, where this, Trump is make America great and screw it, unless it's some crazy relationships with these dictators and so forth. But this idea of isolationism, I mean, this is not what America is about. But it's one guy who's like purporting this to the rest of the world. And it's a time really where we need to come together as countries and do work together and so forth. And that I think the theater can bring about this globalization through the polyvocality. That it's really it can be a harbinger of what the future can be versus this idea of, I'm in my world and, stay away. We're finding to become more and more polarizing.
I will open to the audience here. Yes, I'll try to see all of you guys. Yes, we have the first question.
I get so engaged when you talk about the pedagogic way of it and how to teach it, because I'm an actress and I've also studied here in pedagogic education in theater. And I think that it would be such a shame if you have this flexible and creativeness in writing a piece, and then when you're trying to use it to perform it with students, then you took away the creativity and said, you now have to fulfill my idea of being a polyvocal show. So I think it's extremely necessary that the directors understand that their role also has shifted and must shift in this scenario, because in theater you have also always had the very hierarchy shape of it. And if you sit there and say to the actors that now you should understand how I want you to be polyvocal, it's impossible. But you have to change the way you see the students, not as an empty board that you should, as a director, fill with your knowledge, but as competent actors and people. I think it's absurd to say, is this actor competent enough to perform this play? You should see, what does this person contain of possibilities, and really felicitate for them to be safe enough to feel that they are accepted and enough, so that they can be polyvocal, so that they can also continue the creativity from the text and really explore it. And to do that, you have to let go of your baby, your project. You have to accept that it could possibly fail. And if you do that as a director, if you come there and say that, yeah, I don't know how this will work out, then you start to make a base where we are all here equals. We all try to figure this out. And I think that's extremely necessary in all the educations in theater in Norway, that we remove ourselves from the idea of the acting students to be broken down and rebuilt in the image of the school and what they find is like the right way to do theater.
I think you're saying several things. One is, I think it's impossible to be an effective autocratic director. Okay, I don't think you can be, this is the way it is. I mean, you have to work with the creativity, and you have to work with personalities. I mean, you have to envelop and create a sense of trust and a sense of joy. The process has to be something that's an investment, but also something that's a positive thing. I mean, you can't be, be a tyrant. I mean, that's maybe the old school, but I mean, I work with many millennials. I mean, you don't act like a tyrant. I mean, I have sons, in the 20s. I can't act like a tyrant around them. I mean, they tell me, get buzz off. You know what I mean? So that doesn't work. So it just doesn't work. I agree. I mean, I do think that there are certain programs, for example, in America, certain playwriting programs where you kind of will be led along a certain way. In other words, they'll be working with your creativity, right? And but there will be a certain process that you can expect to go through, and you know that I don't know if that's so much a cleansing process, but there are like things like Fitzmaurice, in which you deconstruct the movement of a personality comes in. You know, maybe it's stooped or something. You have to deconstruct before you reconstruct. That have validity, but it shouldn't be seen as something that's, you know, like kind of whipping the student into shape or anything like that. I think.
Well, I think all we in Norway know what you're talking about, so I don't think we need to agree that this exists, right? So the question is, what do we want? Because I think we're spending so much time trying to struggle with what we have instead of visualizing what we want. And then what we have to do is start doing what we want. It's not only a problem for us writers and for you actors, it's also the problem for the directors. For instance, Erik Fauske, who did directing and master directing here last year, felt that he was all of a sudden forced into a particular way of being, a particular way of leading, a particular way of creating that he didn't feel comfortable with at all. And ended with him actually doing a performance without actors. Just not to have to be like that, not to take part in it. He felt like, in a way, it was hijacked by a culture who wasn't even his or anybody else's. And I think that the question is then, so what do we want to do instead? And I think we have to work that out together. I think professionalization and specialization has been incredibly important for Norwegian theatre to get where we are. But directing is the youngest, absolutely youngest education beside my field, which is playwriting, here. And playwriting is just 6 years old. I mean, now we have it. So the question is, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to apply it? How are we going to read together? How are we going to work together? How are we going to make this...
Well, it goes back to what you were talking about, ethics and ideology before.
Yeah.
That's another question. I mean, I'm not that familiar with, you know, the certain ideologies and so forth that have gone on. But for example, if you had studied with Meisner back in the day, you know, he would scream at actors and torture them, and I mean that was part of the process. You know, you knew you were going to get into that, but acting teachers don't really do that now. In America, people, it's just not. It's sort of evolved, you know. But certainly that was the practice 30 years ago.
Now, but this also, I think what she refers is also connected to the way of producing, you know.
Well,
the role of the director also trying to get a job is a very special, in an institution in Norway, you need to sort of, get in contact with someone, have a very clear idea of what you're going to stage and how you want to stage it. So what's your vision, interpretation, concept, called concept, right? So then these probably, if you get the green light, then you're going to have to find the right actors, which are already part of an ensemble of a theater that can maybe serve that concept. So before you have the first rehearsing day, you already have a lot of ideology in place, which is the consequence of the way you got there. And I think when you talk about Fauske, is of course a person that feels that these plays in the sort of classical production machine of theater is very jeopardized because he can't make theater the way he wants to make theater, and there's very few people like Robert Wilson that can come with a sort of say, I see for myself a room with a green light, 10 million kroners, and then we find out what this green light is and what kind of text you need to get to a certain place to have that possibility.
For example, there was a big rebellion at NYU when Robert Wilson came in to do a piece there, when he was saying, act, you stand here, you do this, you put up your hand like this, we don't want to do that, you know. No, we don't want, and there was like this furor, I mean, about it, you know, and I mean, so yeah, I mean, the actor is just like a machine, you know, like a piece of scenery. So.
But the way I see it actually is a bit like you say it in your book. I mean, this kind of strategy can also exist, can also produce beautiful work. And some actors enjoy working like that. Yeah. So it's not a problem. I mean, if everybody is like, you know, consensual sex, if everybody agrees on having it in this particular way, it's quite fine. It's just not, you know, it's also other strategies needs to be applied to make other type of of aesthetics and enjoyable productions.
It's a political problem. I mean,
Yeah.
because you would have to sort of create other arenas to finance theater, which is make, in a different way, where there are, possibilities to sort of get to production in a different way. I think that would change a lot of the way artists come together, actors, directors. Of course, you can apply, but also if you take also like Kulturrådet, which is a fund here where you can apply. I mean, there is a bureaucracy, there's a lingo, there's a way of applying for the money, describing the project. I mean, it's very few places where you can just say, I need 1 million kronor. Why? Because I'm an artist. And I have to hang out with these other artists, and we have to find out.
Yes, but I think what you're doing
You
right
know.
here, what we are doing here, is the beginning to try and find some other strategies who are not given.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's
So
a
let's do
question
that.
there. No, there's time limits. Is okay. Then I would say that we say thank you for today. We say thank you to Paul and Tale that were here in the conference today, and to you guys that attended. So there's the lunch break and then the workshops, and then I hope I will see you here tonight for the readings on this very stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
See later.
guys.
Thank you.